Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are connecting from. And welcome to this very, hopefully exciting session, which has been themed Old Wine in White Bottle, the Nexus between Climate Security and Fragility in Africa. I am Jide Okeke, and I'm currently serving as the coordinator of the UNDP regional program for Africa, and I shall be moderating the session for the next 90 minutes. Before we go into the session, I would want to express my sincere thanks to our colleagues, Fatma Ahmed, Michelle Mendy, Aisha Jamila, Juni, and Rachel Scott, as well as other colleagues that have ensured that this panel had been introduced and as part of the development dialogue series, and that have put this panel together. We are sincerely grateful for all the support that you've continued to render. Ladies and gentlemen, from Lake Chad to the Karamoja to Mali and elsewhere in Africa, we are seeing three things emerge: correlation, contestation, and connections being made in the relationship between climate change and insecurity. But the nature of the data and evidence on the correlation between climate change and insecurity on the African continent is not entirely straightforward. There are a number of questions that this panel will be seeking to answer. The first is to determine if there is a positive correlation between climate change and insecurity, or is the link between climate change and conflict less conclusive? And then finally, what are the factors or efforts that are being made by regional actors in anticipating and addressing the effects of climate-related risk and emergency in Africa? To help us answer these questions, we have three distinguished panelists. Our first speaker today would help us clarify what I consider to be the regional policy choices on climate security risk in Africa, irrespective of the tensions and contestations between climate change and insecurity. There is a clear consensus that policy response would always be essential. And the African Union is increasingly playing an important role in the area of climate security risk. As such, it is my honor to invite Ambassador Fred Goga to provide his first intervention. Before he does, as many of you may know, Ambassador Fred is currently working within the Office of the African Union Commissioner for Political Affairs, Peace and Security at the African Union. And before that, he was the head of conflict prevention under the previous structure of the African Union Commission, and also served as a senior officer at the African Union mission in Somalia. He has been quite instrumental in initiating a number of peace initiatives on the continent and continues to lead and be responsible for the whole question around the African Union UN partnership in the area of peace and security. Welcome, Ambassador Fred, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Jide. Thank you so much for inviting us to this important discussion. And I want to first, before getting into the discussion, I want to thank the UNDP for the collaboration that we have enjoyed over the years and working together on this particular issue. Jide, as you know, the African Union has increasingly recognized the threats posed on Africa's hard-earned development gains by a continuously changing climate, variability in precipitation and temperatures, and extreme weather events on the continent. Dynamic events such as floods, drought, and cyclones have led to the damage of critical infrastructure, food systems, and most devastatingly, the loss of human life. 68% of extreme weather events occurring on the continent can be attributed to climate change, a slow occurring process to which Africa has contributed infinitesimally. Most recently, South Sudan, Cameroon, Niger, Senegal, and Cote d'Ivoire are among the worst affected by flooding. Though these events were forecasted, it remains to be seen if member states were able to take the recommended and anticipatory actions in compliance with early warning. Our river basins are increasingly subject to changing quantity and quality of fresh water, threatening the development and security of nations and their communities. From the Lake Chad region to the Horn of Africa, unprecedented temperatures are being recorded. This variability is causing undue strain on rural economies, vulnerable groups, and state capacities, and will continue to do so as the global community struggles to meet the Paris Agreement global temperature cap of 2 degrees Celsius for the 21st century. Reliance on land and water resources, underdevelopment, poverty, and climate variability combine to establish conditions of insecurity that are not only difficult and costly to reverse, but are easily exploitable by non-state armed groups, organized criminal networks, and terrorist extremist actors, as you had just mentioned. These dynamics are core to the destabilization of the Lake Chad Basin surrounding communities. Structural conflict prevention and resolution efforts in the region will always be a race against time as climate change continues to impact the environmental and political economy of communities. So what is the African Union doing? The African Union Peace and Security Council has had 3 sessions dedicated to this issue. The first was at its 774th session, which was dedicated to the link between climate change and conflicts in Africa and addressing the security implications. The second one was the 828th session, which focused on climate change funding in line with the Africa Adaptation Initiative to contribute towards peace and security. And the third was the 877th session, which looked at climate change and its impacts on small island developing states. This has been an issue of concern for our decision-making organs. And further, the African Peace and Security Architecture Roadmap mandates our Political Affairs and Peace and Security Department to take a closer look at climate change as a threat multiplier. Following the session of the 774th session of the PSC, the AU Commission was tasked to undertake a study on the nexus between climate change and peace and security on the continent. The AU Commission, with the support of the UNDP, commissioned a study to map out the AUC and the regional economic communities and regional mechanism engagement with climate security, including existing threats, opportunities, and response at the institutional level across the continent. The objective of the study was actually to help us develop a common African position on the nexus between climate change and peace and security. In addition to this, we have actually been working to increase early warning capacity so that we can produce reports that can actually help our leadership and the PSC to warn of short and long-term threats in each region of the continent. And we have also established a cluster where we work with where we work with the Department of Rural Economy and Agriculture and specialized agencies such as the Africa Risk Capacity and SAFGRAD. And we have established a cluster in 2020, which constantly follows the developments on this. We have, lastly, within the AU's country structural conflict prevention framework, there are tools that both highlight the key vulnerability areas, including the environment and climate and change, that are most likely to drive conflict. Here, I would like to inform you that with regard to this particular tool, we have already 3 countries which are on the line. First, we started with Ghana. Now, as I speak to you, there is a delegation that will be heading to Côte d'Ivoire towards the end of this week. And then we have also Zambia Republic, which also has volunteered. And we're working with COMESA and others, and we shall undertake this work together. But going forward, so let me just conclude with some key important highlights. The first thing that we're going to be focusing on, and as requested by the AU Peace and Security Council, is awareness. So we have been requested, the AU Commission has been requested to appoint a special envoy on climate and security to signal an unprecedented commitment to the protection of both our natural endowments as well as security and development. Second, funding. Africa receives only 4% of global climate finance. One of the things that we're going to be doing is to develop a resource mobilization strategy so that we can equip ourselves to deal with these challenges. We will also be looking at the existing funding mechanism so that we can address this threat. Third, collaboration. The AU with the regional economic mechanism will work to harmonize the ability for units, divisions, and departments to jointly prepare and support each other under the umbrella of climate change. So we look forward to working with our regional mechanism and to strengthen our ability to deliver as one. This will include early warning, but also our peace support operation division's capacity to respond in extreme disasters and others. And lastly, commitments. Member states should be continually encouraged to ratify international agreements that commit them to prioritizing climate response. Through the lens of the climate change, the CSVRA is going to be a critical tool in undertaking how fragile member states could be to climate impacts and therefore insecurity. I would like just to limit my comments here, and I look forward to engaging and taking questions. I think that it will be much more than these facts that I'm just throwing out there, but thanks for the opportunity to share with you. Over to you, Jide.
Thank you so much, as always, Ambassador Fred, for such an illuminating presentation. And there will be opportunities for questions shortly after the two next presentations. I had the pleasure of meeting our second panelist over coffee in Addis Ababa, during which she provided a compelling explanation on the ambivalent relationship between climate change and insecurity in Africa. Professor Cleona Riley is currently the executive director of ACLED, and she's also a professor of political violence and geography in the School of Global Studies at the University of Essex in England. Her primary research interest is on the dynamics of conflict, violence, African political environment, early warning, and elite networks. It gives me a lot of pleasure to invite Professor Riley for her initial intervention. Over to you, Cleona.
Thanks very much, Jide. It's a real pleasure to be here. And I'm coming from Texas. It's quite early, so I hope that I'm coherent. So I'm going to talk today about the strength of the relationship that we've established between climate change and conflict. And I have a visualization that I hope, there's two visualizations. I hope that, yeah, that's the one we'll start with. And I wanted to really challenge this notion that there is a strong or consistent or even clear relationship between climate change and conflict that's been established in the kind of more quantitative evidence-based literature. And here is a really good way maybe to think about the very initial way this is set up, which is that the presumption is this macro change, which is happening all the time across the entire continent in both slow and abrupt moving ways, is supposed to have this direct effect on conflict patterns, which is on the right. And the link between them is very, very poorly specified in almost all studies. What they're looking for is a connection between one and the other. So did conflict get worse or change due to the influence of a specific climate condition? That's really been very poorly proven, if at all. Or did other known conflict factors change to explain the shifts, if any, in conflict? Not really. And did the same climate conditions happen elsewhere without a change in conflict? So a comparative study, not really. Does the climate change effect on violence act through some other factor like population, etc.? Again, because there's so much varied conflict on the continent already, trying to attach it to, again, what is a persistent, widespread, slow and abrupt moving change like climate change is incredibly difficult to do in kind of our standard way of looking at it. But what we do know, of course, is that climate change is persistent, so is conflict, and how can we connect these two things, if at all? What we know is that there's, of course, quite a lot of local community agency about how they can adapt to or be resilient to climate change. And the climate conflict nexus, as it's currently set up, really tends to ignore the ongoing and very persistent and very widespread efforts to adapt to climate change, or even mitigate its worst effects that is already happening in local communities. So Ambassador Fred mentioned earlier about climate finance, which is a really robust and growing area of concern, and how it's applied and who gets it and how local communities can adapt to and use that kind of assistance is completely ignored within the climate security discussion, even though this is the reality on the ground. People are adapting. They may be adapting in not great ways, and some others might be adapting very well, and that might cause consternation. But really, there's very poor evidence to suggest that this relationship between a climate change and a conflict, any change in conflict or any instigation of conflict, is actually present. And instead, what we do know is that climate change is happening, local communities are seeking to deal with these changes, and then of course that's informed by the already existing issues about conditions and logistical considerations that these communities are dealing with. Now, if we were to chop off this visualization just at local communities' behaviors and the outcome of conflict or cooperation, it would be just as valid, as in the climate is not the determining factor here. It's really, again, there's no mystery about why conflict occurs. It is a competition for authority on all sorts of political scales. And if we were to just, again, chop off this visualization to remove climate, you would still get conflict. So the question really is that how is it maybe shaping those competitive or that kind of nexus of competition that we already know exists that does create either conflict or cooperation at the local level. I will say that some studies that have been done have found that in the face of very, very severe and abrupt climate change, such as a disaster, that there is a very high rate of cooperation. It doesn't lead to conflict. People don't start killing each other when they are in fact faced with a much bigger threat at their feet, such as a disaster. So we should really be giving people far more credit about how they're trying to adapt to climate change and assist in how they're trying to adapt, rather than assuming that the outcome is violence. So the next slide, please. Here I wanted to bring up the situation which I hear about quite often when I ask people on the continent about what their actual environmental concerns are and how that might or might not affect, as I mentioned before, kind of the incentives for conflict at the local level. And so what I wanted to do here is to try to bring out what that middle part is. So those considerations that must be taken into account. So as I said, you have a persistent, widespread, and deepening crisis of climate change, which in its pure form is changes in patterns of rainfall, temperature, disaster occurrence, and severity. And then you have what are ongoing considerations for everybody on the continent when it comes to environmental management and climate change management. You have natural resource management, land access and quality debates, adaptation and mitigation. You have yields and productivity policies, demographic and capacity debates, and disaster management. All of these things are occurring now. Climate change will affect those things, and whether or not those things affect conflict is really what we should be considering. And here I basically have the climate change engagement of those different issues, the primary determinants about whether or not they are going to directly affect something that we should be considering about in reference to conflict, and then its conflict likelihood. And so here, for example, natural resource management. So what we need to consider is the types of resources, state extraction, and local politics. We all know that those are really, really important factors when we talk about natural resource management. And there's an intense planning component when it comes to how we're going to deal with resources in the face of persistent climate change. But to be totally honest, the links between climate change and the links between natural resource management and conflict are extremely weak. There was a debate kind of in the late 90s and early 2000s about the link between climate change and, between conflict and resources. And it was largely kind of a red herring, which is that if there was the opportunity to use resource wealth within a conflict, it would be used, but certainly countries without an abundance of natural resources were not necessarily peaceful. So like I said, inconsistent and weak links. But natural resource management is still pretty fundamental when we're talking about climate change preparation. Let's take another one, which is land access and quality, which is that this issue is very important in LDCs, mainly because of the marginal, often issues around land access and quality. And we know that local authority ownership, access and inputs, identity politics, all affect land access and quality debates. We also know, of course, that land access and quality debates do affect local conflict quite a bit, and mainly because, as I mentioned before, there's a competition over that authority and that access. And this slide is available to everybody, so I won't go through everything. But adaptation and mitigation is probably the area that we should spend the most attention on, in part because what we have is an issue of need versus efficacy of, for example, climate finance, public and private financing, and the ability of areas to absorb changes. These are so fundamental when we're talking about climate change, but there's almost no relationship between that and conflict, and which is excellent, which is that we can focus on something that is going to improve the lived experience of people on the ground without necessarily assuming that it's going to become a security issue. And in fact, what we found is that there's often some competition that emerges over climate finance at the local level, but that persistent access to climate finance that helps people adapt and mitigate the worst effects of climate change, and of course be flexible and resilient, is really the best way to pursue this. Although adaptation financing through public bodies is decreasing, and we're going to have to start considering what private financing of adaptation looks like, which is a bit of a strange conversation for people to have. Now, I know that my time is running out, so I just wanted to emphasize to you that rather than assuming, or rather than keeping on talking about whether or not a model has provided for us a direct relationship or a strong relationship between climate change and conflict, let's think about the already existing issues that we know that climate change affects within LDCs and within the content specifically, and focus on whether or not those increase things like competition and coordination or any sort of authority struggles at the local level. And I think that that would be the best way forward. And it also offers us quite a lot of policy relevant inputs for this question. Thanks very much.
Cleona, thank you so much for such a compelling explanation on the ambivalent relationship that you see as being prevalent between climate change and insecurity. And I think to have a flip side of that sort of conversation, we now turn to Dr. Florian, who would be our third speaker. He's done extensive work where he's gathered empirical data on what you could consider to be the positive correlation between climate change and insecurity across Africa, from Somalia to Mali. He is currently a senior researcher and director of CIPRI's Climate Change and Risk Program, specializing in peace and conflict research, environmental and climate security, and international security. He is also an affiliated researcher at this research school for international water cooperation at the Department of Peace and Conflict Research at Uppsala University, and was also specially appointed as a professor of the Network for Education and Research on Peace and Sustainability in Hiroshima University in Japan. Florian, it's really a pleasure to have you on here today, and over to you.
Thank you so much, Gide, and I want to follow the compliments for setting up this event. I think this is very timely, and the development dialogue series is something really intriguing to follow. So compliments to UNDP and colleagues for setting that up. I'm not sure I'm going to be going the opposite direction of the previous speaker, but I think there are some important dimensions, I guess, where we divert to some extent, but I think that is a diversion in perspective taken rather than disagreement on the evidence. To start off with, what we see is that the double burden of climate change and conflict is already today compounding the hardship of already highly vulnerable populations. And what I mean with that is that it is not primarily the question climate change leading to conflict, but the acknowledgement, and I think that is a really important point that we need to pay much more attention to, is that populations affected by conflict are living in areas that are highly exposed to climate change, not looking at the relationship, but putting both together, and the double burden that societies are facing in these contexts is something really important to pay attention to. The way I look at the current research literature on the broader field of climate security and the interlinkages of climate change and conflict, but more broadly human insecurity, is that we're actually starting to see an emerging consensus in the literature that climate change is increasing the risks of insecurity. The likelihood of insecurity is increasing. Acknowledging that the determinism there and clear relationships is something that we should avoid, and we need context-specific knowledge and information and evidence that is, I think, crucial to move that forward. So what we're seeing is then that human security risks of today are on the one hand becoming increasingly the hard security challenges of tomorrow. But I think what is really important here, looking at the policy solutions area, and what is really the challenge is there are no hard security solutions. You can't fight those impacts, and you can't address the double burden that societies are facing with any military means. What does that mean? In my interpretation, that means that the security landscape and the peace and security landscape, as we know, has changed. You know, some are talking about climate change as an actorless threat, which I think is very accurately reflecting sort of the point. There is nobody to fight. So I think that is something important to keep in mind. But with the changing security landscape, and that is what our research increasingly shows, and what I find one of the most intriguing and challenging areas, both on the research side and on the policy response side, is that climate change is by changing the security landscape, it is changing what it needs to take peace, to build peace. It is changing peace building and what we need to do, and the challenges that peace building efforts are facing, especially on the continent. To put that in a number, we see that 6 out of the 10 biggest UN-led peace operations are in areas highly exposed to climate change, the majority of those in Africa, and that is not counting the biggest peace operation that is out there, which is AMISOM in Somalia, which is, of course, also in an area highly exposed to climate change and facing these challenges. So what we did in 2 recent studies, one on Somalia and one on Mali, is to change the perspective. I was tired of that discussion, does climate change cause conflict, right? I think there's a value to that, but actually they're really interesting and important questions to ask. What does the impact of climate change mean for building peace? How does it affect the mandate of a peace operation? How are peace operations responding to those challenges that they're facing in their everyday mandate, and by extension, the UN and other international actors on the ground? And what really surprised me was this substantive impact that we see climate change is having on the mandate of several of those peace operations. We see that both on the one hand in the impact on peace and security, but we also see that on the impact on governance and state building, and we see that on the impact of development and humanitarian responses. 3 core components of peace operations typically that we see in those mandates. I put the link in the chat to those 2 studies in a moment, so I don't go into much more detail. But I think it is really important to untangle those complex interlinkages here, just to highlight 2 really interesting dynamics that also hint at the importance of the response, policy response here. Is that we see on the one hand climate change impacting DDR programming in instances where it links to recruitment efforts. Those reasons are much more complex, and there are multiple pathways and multiple explanations why people are joining rebel groups, and UNDP led really excellent research on that. But of course, the livelihood challenges that climate change is also exerting, in addition to to conflicts, is one of the factors that increasingly pushes civil or actors into rebel groups, or makes them susceptible to recruitment. We see that both in Mali and in Somalia. The other thing that really opens a real big question for a lot of actors in the peace building field is its impacts on peace agreements. The uncertainty and instability and the various dynamics that climate change is exerting on society, on vulnerabilities and these dynamics, is undermining peace agreements that were put in place. And I think that is really evident in Somalia and the city of Baidoa, when the power sharing agreement that was put in place by UNSOM along clan lines was essentially made obsolete by increased displacement because of conflict and because of increasing flooding and droughts in the country, which just changed the clan composition of the city, putting essentially the division that was made obsolete, which raises a question in addition to that: how do we make peace agreements more resilient? Resilient is maybe the wrong word, but how do we build this uncertainty into peace agreement to make them last? I think those are two examples, and there are multiple more in the studies that for me show clearly these new challenges that peace building is facing. But I think it's really important to highlight that actually peace operations are responding to these challenges, sometimes very explicitly, as we see in the case of Somalia. We see an environmental security advisor deployed to the missions through the UN environment, which is helping in coordination between different actors, which is highlighting the issue and having a really important bridging function here between the mission, the country team, government, and international organizations in the field. We see the common country assessment taking up the issue, and also in relation to this more seriously to come to or bring in a different type of response that is beyond the one that is more an integrated response of various UN agencies in the field. I think the drought coordination centers were one of the key things here, also to highlight where a joint response was brought together through bringing different humanitarian actors together in the response. But we also see implicit responses, especially in the case of Mali, which I think is a really interesting feature also. And in the interviews we are doing with staff in the missions, we see that, well, people don't know they are actually responding to climate security challenges, right? Some are seeing something very explicit, but don't have a mandate or don't feel they have a mandate to respond. But some see very clearly that there are seasonal patterns in violence against civilians, etc., that are important to delve deeper into and highlight. So I think it's really interesting to see that, while on the one hand we see clearly impacts on peace operations through increasing pressures of climate change, we see also responses. So where do we go from here, and what do we need? And I think we need two things, and I think that we see reflected in the broader UN discourse at the moment. And I think also within the African Union, we see that reflected. One is a risk-based approach. Looking at climate security as a risk factor, not as a threat multiplier, which is a language that is in itself limiting our responses. It gets us all excited, but it doesn't tell us what to do. Towards a risk-based approach, climate-related security risks is the UN wording typically, which opens up a more inclusive development-oriented approach. It puts human security responses in the center of these approaches, and thereby very much reflecting that there are no hard security solutions. What we also need is ownership. We need ownership in regions. We need ownership within the African Union. Ambassador Fred is in here, and I think under his leadership and colleagues, the AU has done extraordinary work in this field in moving the agenda forward and developing this space. We look in our research at regional organizations and have studied quite a few, and I can say that the African Union's response is outstanding in this regard. Not that there's no things to improve, obviously, but I think they're certainly leading the way. And if I see that it is also a product of changing the framing around climate security in this space. What we need more is probably a further integration of the links between the African Union and regional economic communities to strengthen a subsidiary system in a way that if a region cannot cope with these challenges, then we bring in additional actors. And I guess that is also true at the end of that chain for the UN as an actor to come in and support those processes. But I think there's a clear need for synergy than building up different structures. And I think we see promising signs in that regard. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Florian. Very, very insightful in terms of the evidence emerging from Somalia and Mali. Ladies and gentlemen and distinguished participants, we are now at the segment where we are free to ask questions. And I know some of the questions have been coming. But before I turn to a couple of participants to maybe pose their questions directly, there are about 3 sets of questions I would want to pose to the panelists. The first is to Ambassador Fred. Through the African Union Commission reform, we have seen in recent times the crystallization between the African governance architecture and the African peace and security architecture. I think this is very much clear from the newly established Department of Political Affairs, Peace and Security. But as we think about the advancement of thinking around climate security, how are we expected to include or mainstream climate change as an important risk factor to stability and development on the African continent within these 2 architectures? Are there any current thinking around that? And hopefully, how would this be implemented? I would turn to Cleona. Over the years, you've questioned the ways in which research questions are formulated and how they inherently create flaws in the type of evidence that we generate around climate security risk. And I think this is some of the questions that you also raised. What type of questions should we be asking to deepen the clarity between climate change and insecurity? And then finally, to Florian, in the publications that you cited, you did emphasize the need for long-term solutions and how sometimes they are incompatible with short-term programming funding. And this is something that we see even in development institutions like ours. What, in your view, should be the short and long-term investments that development practitioners should be working on around climate security risk, based on the recent evidence from your research? Perhaps you could answer the questions and then we'll turn to the participants. Over to you, Ambassador Fred. Ambassador Fred, you're still muted. Okay.
Oh, sorry about that, Ginny. Thank you so much. Yes, indeed, we have undergone some reforms, and things are settling well, I would say. And we've had some conversations with our leadership, and this is obviously a priority for us. And like I said in my presentation, we have a cluster, and we're developing a strategy, which hopefully there will be a special envoy which will drive it and try to see how to implement it. But obviously, the big component of it is about conflict prevention, and it's also about governance. I didn't hear the word governance actually being mentioned here that much. So it will be probably seated in the governance and conflict prevention directorate, but all of us, of course, working together because it's a cluster. We have established a cluster which brings different departments together. So we're trying to, nothing is set in stone yet, but this is the thinking already, and we're trying to make sure that in everything that we do, that this is something that we factor in. And also, as you know, a part of our priorities with the UNDP in our collaboration as well, we have highlighted that, and we keep on highlighting it with other partners. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Fred. We now turn to Professor Cleona.
Thanks very much, Jide, for an excellent question. So I would, in picking up on what Ambassador Fred would say, I would focus far more on the climate governance issue in research to be, so I would actually just stop focusing on conflict as the focus, in part just because conflict has so many different ways in which it's incentivized and its modalities and its patterns and its agents. Trying to connect that to a climate change reason or explanation has been a mess. So I think we should stop doing it. And instead, I think that when we think about the many policies and the many practices that have been put in place in order to address climate change on the continent, we need to think about specifically who are the winners and losers once you implement these policies, because that will in turn affect the competition that arises as a result of that. So what I'm trying to say is that effectively, how do the power relationships change as a result of new policies around resource management, adaptation, natural disaster management? Once we understand that, and once we understand how we have inadvertently or purposefully shifted who is responsible, as Ambassador Fred was saying, who is responsible for implementing this change or benefiting from this change, we will have a lot more insight into how it's causing competition or how it even may increase grievances.
Thank you, Professor. Over to you, Florian.
It's sometimes surprising you're over a year into the pandemic and Zoom meetings and you still forget to unmute. No, thank you, Jide. Great question. And I think absolutely the biggest problem that we face. I think the solution to coming from bridging the short-term, long-term funding divide is identifying synergies. We need to come to an understanding that we need to see that as one, and that one thing that annoys me slightly that comes through in a lot of the interviews is that, and I have to put that a disclaimer in front of that. I know that these are really complicated situations and that these actors are out there and responding to. So I'm not blaming anything for having that, but I think we need to shift our thinking to avoid quick fixes. Right? In Mali, we saw quick impact projects, which are great, which are brilliant to respond to some of the impacts and rebuild a school. But apparently that school was rebuilt every year after every flood. There must be a way of thinking long-term and coming up with better strategies of building climate resilience in these spaces. And I think that also demands from us, and that's maybe the uncomfortable lesson for the humanitarian side of the house, is rethinking the relationship with the security actors, right? We need to come to a more integrated deliver as one approach. We need to identify those synergies between different actors and build long-term oriented incentive structures. And I think Somalia is a really interesting example here again, where that was actually the plan, where we have a drought impact needs assessment, which is a humanitarian roadmap, right, to respond to the drought, but which was coupled with a resilience recovery framework, right? And I think that is really important. Again, not that this was that solved everything. I don't think we need to be naive about that, but I think that is the thinking we need. And we need to work towards better responses in that way, on better understanding what works.
Thank you so much. I think there are about 3 sets of questions, and this will be asked first to Florian. I think it's related to your earlier intervention around incentives. The audience would like to know, could you propose an incentive structure that induces early action by stakeholders into early preemptive action instead of waiting for it to turn into a full-blown crisis response? If so, do we need to look at how, the second question is by another member of the audience who has said that, do we need to look at how climate crisis affects peace building? Is that another way of saying that although there is a weak correlation between climate change and conflict, as illustrated by Professor Riley, conflict change prolongs, or climate change, I mean, the person meant to say, prolongs conflict. And then there is a third question, which is, we would appreciate to hear the perspective of the research from Africa and African universities. They're experts from Africa on climate security. I think this is something that perhaps Ambassador Fred can speak to in terms of some of the partnerships with African research institutions. So let's start with Florian on incentives, and then we can turn to Professor Riley, and finally to Fred.
No, thank you so much for the question. I think that is really, really great. The way prevention is always a tricky part, right? And I guess UNDP is very well aware of that, the difficulty of showing the results of prevention. The way we see this climate change and conflict link, or climate change and security, is through a three-pronged approach, essentially. We see the climate impacts on society. Those translate into climate and social vulnerabilities. And those translate into increased conflict risks. Those conflict risks we see through different pathways. I can also share that in the chat, the different pathways that we have there. But the important step here is the climate the vulnerability element. This is an important and really significant stage for interventions, for development-based interventions, for prevention. And I think here's the important part where we need to come to, where we need more research that shows us what type of interventions are reducing or are increasing climate resilience of communities, are increasing development, are building peace, and are equally climate adaptation and climate mitigation, depending on the interventions. That is, I think, the golden rule where we need to get it. We need to start to understand those synergies. We need to understand what works. And maybe that is actually the interesting research question here, to study the cases where the same climate impacts and vulnerabilities are not translating into insecurities, to understand what is it? Is it social capital of communities? Is it something else? There was some really interesting research done by a colleague in Uppsala on that the availability, access to groundwater during a drought was mitigating community violence, essentially, right? That shows us really interesting spaces for intervention and prevention. The question on does it prolong conflict? It does, right? It inhibits peace building. On the one hand, that is very clearly visible in the research and in these processes. But we also shouldn't be naive about that we solve the climate crisis and we solve climate impacts in a country and then it's peace, right? That's not going to be true for Somalia. That's not going to be true for Mali. That's not going to be true for most cases around the world. So we need to see this is one of the contributing factors. If we do not look at it, our analysis, our conflict analysis is incomplete. That's why we need to take it into account, because it also guides our perspective into new responses, I think. And lastly, just allow me to respond to the weak correlation point made. I think that absolutely depends on the context. And I think that is also what the literature very clearly shows us. I would not claim in a case that's like Somalia that the link is weak, right? We see very clearly through both quantitative and qualitative research that there is a clear link. In other cases, that might not be the case, right? And that is not the case. So we need that honesty in the debate, avoid overgeneralization, focus on context, and really understanding those dynamics. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Florian. Impressive. Professor Riley?
I really must counter some of these things. I mean, the link is weak. It is weak in Somalia. It is weak in Mali. It doesn't prolong conflict. And the strongest effects of climate change that we're seeing across the continent are in non-conflict spaces. They're in places like Malawi, which there is absolutely no indication that extreme climate change risk is in any way creating social instability. In fact, the exact opposite, which is that increased and better programming is leading to a consolidation of authority at the local level, which is really what is the problem in most of these conflict areas. As you mentioned, in most of these places, if not all of these places, solving the climate change dilemma, which won't happen, but we can certainly move to adapt to it, solving that dilemma will not solve those conflicts, indicating that climate is really not affecting these things in a strong way. And I think that creating this interpretation that there's a primary risk of climate is a distortion of what's happening in these conflict environments. And that really does worry me. While I agree that trying to fix how people can access water during drought environments is important in and of itself, I don't think it's important as a security issue, because there are, in fact, very few issues with conflict during heavy droughts. In fact, the issues with communal violence in drought-affected environments is often right before the rainy season, not during it. And this has been proven over and over and over again in responses to pastoral violence. And so I think what we need to do is to stop relying on models which don't take into effect what's causing the conflict, don't take into effect the groups engaged in that conflict, don't take into effect the dynamics of that violence, and instead are just often national level or very poor subnational models, throwing a bunch of variables into a model and hoping for a response, and then generalizing those outcomes as if they're applicable. Like, I don't know a single person who works in pastoral environments who say, yeah, definitely it was the change in weather that led these people to start fighting. If anything, severe disasters, as I previously mentioned, especially in pastoral environments, increase cooperation within those spaces, because they are in fact dealing with very limited resources which they're sharing. In the counter to that, when you actually have more resources to contest over, you get more conflict, which is kind of the antithesis of what the climate change conflict debate seems to be about. And my point being is that they're both very important aspects. We don't need to connect them where they're not connected.
Excellent, excellent. This is precisely why we decided to convene this panel discussion. Precisely because we wanted to understand the different dynamics and perspectives. So I think it's really important that at least we're able to come up with some emerging consensus by the end of this session. But Ambassador Fred, a question was raised about your interaction with African researchers and some of the work you probably have been doing with ISS and the rest of the think tanks within the continent.
The question is for me, isn't it,
yes.
Jide?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, thank you.
Go ahead.
Thank you so much. First of all, I would like to say three things. First, I would like to thank Florian and his team. We've worked well together, and I think we want to continue working together. I would like to say that we have actually over the last couple of months, we've been looking into experts on this particular issue. And, we have found that actually we do have a lot of experts, but not enough on the continent. And I think that as we develop the document policy, we'll be developing a roster of some of the experts on this particular issue. And you'll be surprised, the people you often need is, you need hydrologists, but they're not that many. They exist, but they're not that many. And so this is a capacity that I think that we will need to invest in, and we will be developing this road together on this. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you. Maybe we should just open the floor now. If anyone would want to speak directly to the panelists, please feel free to do so. Fatma, please let me know if this is possible. There are a number of questions that have been raised. If not, I would just read the second set of questions. Is there anyone who wants to raise their hands and answer and ask the panelists questions directly? If not, I would go to the second set of questions. And the first is, I am interested in the interconnection between climate, environmental change, and conflict. Some environmental changes are man-made and then impact on climate deforestation. For example, in Darfur, the desertification has reduced the amount of grazing and farming land available to pastoralists and farmers, bringing them into conflict over resources. Are we saying they are not connected and thus don't necessarily have any causal impact? That's the first question, and I think this is for Cleona and Florian. The second question is for Florian. I said Florian stated that population living in conflict happen to be in the places heavily affected by climate change. I'm trying to understand which of these conflicts, which of these climate change and conflict which has led to the other, climate change or conflict? Or is it just a coincidence? I think the question here is again around the type of relationship that exists between climate change and conflict. So I think there is still quite a lot of questions around the evidence around this. Cleona, do you want to come in first? And then Florian, you'll go in next.
Sure, I'm just trying to undo the video. Great. Okay, sure. Of course, there are questions about it. My first interpretation, and I spent a lot of time looking at conflict patterns on the continent in like on a day-to-day basis. And the first thing I would say is that two bad things happening in the same place don't have to be related to each other. And there is the assumption that they do, and they really don't. Because as I mentioned in my presentation, one of the issues with the climate change conflict debate is that climate change is widespread over the continent. It's happening at very different timescales. It's intensifying in some areas and less in others. And conflict at the same time is happening generally in most places across the continent at very different modalities and intensifications. And so what we cannot do, and what has not been done, and which I don't think can be done, is to somehow link the modalities and the intensity of conflict in space one with the climate change impacts in that same space or around it. There is just too much variability. And the implication of the last 10 years or so has been that that is in some ways a linear relationship, and it is not. It is not. That is a result of either poor models or pushing an agenda that simply does not have the evidence to support it. And what I wanted to do in my presentation, which perhaps I have not done, is to emphasize that, again, there's no mystery why conflict occurs. It is a competition about authority, and how that authority is represented at the local level or even at the regional or national level is over these issues of governance, which I've laid out as specific environmental issues. And that as climate change affects those issues, which is management, adaptation, natural disasters, etc. As climate change affects those issues, there is an incredibly different relationship between those issues and conflict. And we should not presume that it's an always intensifying or increasing relationship. It's actually quite different than that. And we need to bring far more nuance into how we're discussing this issue. Presuming that Darfur is violent, it also had climate change, therefore climate change caused the Darfur crisis, is ignoring decades of conflict, decades of politics, and decades of poor authority in that region. And what it does is it depoliticizes what's happening in these spaces to these people in favor of this external explanation for it. And I really am fundamentally against that, because what we've done that far too often in conflict studies on the continent, which is to depoliticize why they've occurred in the first place. And this seems to me going down that same alley.
Thank you, Cleona. I know Ambassador Fred has to leave now. Perhaps he wants to say any closing words, final remarks from Ambassador Fred, or has he left already? I can see he's still on. Okay, Florian, over to you.
Yeah, I'm thinking what to respond to exactly. I think what the academic debate is showing us, and the last issue of the Journal of Peace Research very clearly shows that also, and acknowledges the indirect links and the complex links between climate change and insecurity, is really important. We have made significant progress in the last years in understanding this relationship. I fully agree with Professor Raleigh on that we need to avoid generalization. We need better research, we need better evidence. That does not mean that climate change is not a contributing factor to these issues. And I think what we need to emphasize, and I think her wording was primary risk. Yeah, absolutely, I would agree, right? It is not, but it is an absolutely important factor that we need to also take into account when doing our analysis. And we see that very clearly, and I think there's a very strong divide in the qualitative and quantitative literature that we have not yet resolved. The qualitative literature in a lot of those cases shows us very clearly that there is a link between climate change and increased community violence, increasing human security issues, and the potential of translating into grievances, etc. I think that is important, and we need to keep that in mind also. And if you, my wording here is that we need to broaden our perspective from conflict to the broader security implications, human security implications on the ground. And the literature on pastoralism, for instance, I think that is absolutely interesting and fascinating from a researcher perspective, right? Because we see very clearly cases where climate change and pastoralist violence have absolutely nothing to do with each other. But we also see cases where it does. And finding explanations on why, where, and when it does contribute to violence is absolutely pivotal in the question we need to ask. I think that we're in a really interesting space and time at the moment in this climate security debate, because we are at an interaction of that we see that we need a response to climate change in these cases. We see climate change already unfolding today. But in a lot of cases, we don't know what the risks are. And we need to both have an honesty and openness and humbleness about the availability of evidence. There are cases where we know, and there are cases where we don't. And I think that we need to be open in our risk assessments and emphasize and carefully flag that as researchers for policymakers on where do we know, what do we know, and what are the limitations of our research. And I think I'll leave it at that. And I remember hopefully to share the publications that I wanted to share.
Thank you so much to you both. I think we're getting to a space where we can also begin to have some sort of emerging consensus around what we've been discussing, despite the different schools of thought that have emerged. I think the first takeaway from my side is that there is an emerging consensus that climate change is increasingly posing a risk to insecurity in Africa. And one way of doing that is to also understand that it is not necessarily causation, it is a contributing factor to insecurity. And we've seen this from some of the evidence that has emerged. The second is that there are no hard security solutions. And this is what Florian emphasized quite repeatedly in his presentation. We need to increasingly emphasize soft security interventions by leveraging on what Professor Riley called local community agency and adaptation measures. And this will be critical in how we respond to the consequences of climate change in the African continent. And the third is the whole question around addressing the traditional deficit associated with governance. I think this is something that I think Ambassador Fred reminded us to do, that governance and peace building measures would always be at the heart of addressing the structural drivers that leads to insecurity on the African continent, irrespective of whether they are caused by climate change or other variables. It is always going to be very key that we strengthen our governance performance across the continent. On that note, I would want to perhaps ask, I know Cleona also has to jump into another meeting. Do you have any concluding remarks, both Florian and Cleona, before we end today's session?
I am happy to have participated, of course. I think this has been a vigorous debate, which is really important for the issues at hand. I think we're getting closer, as Jide mentioned, to a more nuanced and perhaps insightful understanding about exactly where good policy, both conflict-related policy, but also development and climate change-related policy, can be implemented without actually exacerbating some of the worst effects of both climate change and conflict. And I think that's what everybody wants out of this discussion.
Florian?
I think that was great and a really insightful discussion and important discussion on this topic. And I wanted to just compliment you again for hosting us, congratulate you on that, and also highlight the important work that UNDP is doing in this space, also as part of the climate security mechanism in New York, in trying to work much more across different UN agencies on this issue and increase the knowledge and evidence base in the UN system specifically. Thank you.
Thank you. Before we leave, I think there is a pressing question from one of our African Union colleagues, and they would like to take the floor. Please bear with us, Florian and Cleona. Hannah, are you there? And would you like to add anything?
Hello there. Yes, I'm here. Hi all, thanks so much for your presentations. I'm currently working with the University of Edinburgh on an early warning system on climate-related security risks, including conflict for UNEP. And having talked with multiple organizations as part of this project and having read a lot of literature, my sense is that in this field that there is an implicit acceptance that there is a climate conflict relationship, either indirect or direct. And so, Cleona, given your disagreement on this, if you were to work with such organizations that have reserved large amounts of funding and external sponsors with certain ideas and agendas, and have developed also these blueprints of how they think these are connected, how would you deal with this to bring in this much needed nuance? Thank you.
Thanks very much, Hannah. That's a great question. So besides being kind of an agent of chaos, which is usually my role in these things, what I would say is that whenever I actually speak to somebody who's trying to grapple with exactly what to do about these issues, they very quickly retreat from the absolutist view that there's a straightforward, clear relationship, right? And so then they start thinking about the exact environments in which they have to work and weighing all the different factors that are primary, secondary, tertiary effects. And in early warning, it's really interesting because, of course, early warning, whether it is about climate or otherwise, or conflict, which is what I'm most familiar with, really does need to grapple with whether or not you're seeing correlated peaks and lulls, so correlated movement with this. And because we don't see correlated movement in the very short term when we look at things by week or by month or in those periods, in different geographic periods, really what I think is particularly important is to do an evaluation of how climate change, adaptation, and resilience policies and practices and programs have mitigated where we knew there to be conflict previously. So whether it's communal or militia-based conflict or elite initiated conflict, whether or not people building up community around having to sort out local adaptation projects has in fact then had this secondary effect of mitigating their likelihood to be engulfed in conflict surrounding them because of this kind of trust and legitimacy that's been built up over this local governance. I think that is some of the most important work being done. I did a pilot in Kenya about it recently in order to kind of encourage this sort of thinking. And what we found is that when there was climate finance going to communities that were historically much more likely to contest each other over resources, they were far less likely to do so because they brought their contestation to the meeting room where they were going to talk about who got what in a way that did not lead to any sort of conflict at all. And I mean, the difficulty with that, of course, is that it's a situation where you have about, I don't know, 1,000 different local committees rather than one big policy to solve everything. But that's what I think is likely to be the outcome for this, which is that it's not, both climate and conflict are locally experienced, and they both need to be dealt with on that same scale. Thanks for the question. Very interesting.
Thank you. Florian, would you like to comment?
No, I agree.
Okay, excellent. I think you all deserve a virtual applause. It's been a rich conversation, one that would certainly continue. And my personal takeaway, 4 things. Analysis is still important, and we would continue to mine data around the evidence on climate change and insecurity on the African continent. It would not be exhaustive to rely on existing data. I think the second is awareness on the basis of evidence is always going to be key, and Ambassador Fred made this point quite eloquently. We also need to invest. We need to invest in elevating the local community agency and adaptation measures that exist locally. I think this is something that has often been missing in the narrative around intervention. So we really would need to ensure that we harvest data around local mitigating measures and how, as development partners, we can work with these local communities to reinforce or expand their solutions. And lastly, partnerships. We mentioned the climate security mechanism, which is extremely important in pulling UN agencies together. I think this would continue to be relevant. We also need to build partnership with local research institutions, very much like what we have with some of our European research institutions and elsewhere, in ensuring that the messaging around this is one that could take or identify some solutions for local communities on the African continent. We hope to develop an op-ed from this session, and so that we can keep the memory of the outcome of this session together, and of course convey more meetings in due course. On that note, we would like to thank you all for joining today's session, and we wish you a good afternoon or a good morning if you're in New York. Bye for now.
Thank you very much, everybody.
Thanks all.